Hey heroes, and welcome to another incredible episode of History of the Mar-Vell Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. Richard Milhouse Jones, or Rick as he preferred to be called, was born in Scarsdale, Arizona. His parents, Albert and Elizabeth, lost their lives in a tragic car accident when he was very young, and Rick spent the remainder of his childhood moving from orphanage to orphanage. At one point during this, he found a barrel filled with old comic books and read about many of the costumed heroes from the 1940s. His prized possession, however, was an acoustic guitar given to him by his father, which he used to hone his musical talents. But as he entered his adolescent years, his rebellious nature caused him to be sent to a home for troubled teenagers called Tempest Town. While there, he attempted to organize the other boys to protest the squalid conditions they were forced to endure. In response, the corrupt headmaster smashed Rick's guitar in front of him and ordered his security administrator to beat the boy into submission. However, Rick would not let his spirit be broken, and after being thrown back with the other boys, he pulled a harmonica from his pocket and quoted his father by saying, "You can't stop the music." That same night, Rick made his escape from Tempest Town, disassembling a bed frame and using the metal pieces to pry open the bars covering the window. The security administrator tried to intervene, but the other boys held him back, and Rick managed to get in one parting shot before slipping away. He also tried to convince the others to come with him, but with nowhere to go, they elected to stay behind. Over the next several years, Rick drifted across the American Southwest, traveling from state to state and taking whatever menial jobs he could get to survive. He did well enough to get himself an old car, met other teens on his travels, and was always eager to prove himself. Then one day, when Rick was 16 years old, he found himself in New Mexico, where a teenage boy named Gary Swanson dared him to sneak onto the bomb testing area of the military's desert base. Swanson and his friends never actually expected him to go through with it, but Rick quickly accepted the challenge and drove off. He reached the entrance where two guards were posted and used a firecracker he'd been saving for Independence Day to draw them away before simply driving his car through the barricade. Unbeknownst to Rick, however, the Air Force was preparing to test a powerful new explosive device, the Gamma Bomb. As Rick drove into the test area, he was noticed by the bomb's inventor, Dr. Bruce Banner. Parked within range of the bomb's deadly radiation, Rick sat in his car playing his harmonica as Banner rushed towards him. In a desperate attempt to save him, Bruce grabbed Rick and pulled him towards a nearby protective trench. He threw Rick into the hole, but at that exact moment, before he could leap in himself, the bomb exploded behind him, bathing Banner in what should have been a deadly blast of gamma radiation. However, Bruce miraculously survived, and even though he couldn't stop screaming in pain and panic, Rick brought him to the base's med lab. Several hours later, Bruce finally came to his senses, but he and Rick soon discovered that his gamma exposure would have serious consequences. Not long afterwards, as the sun went down, Bruce Banner experienced his first transformation into a gray-skinned creature that would soon be known as the Incredible Hulk. And while the Hulk was initially hostile towards Rick, Jones felt indebted to Banner for saving his life and resolved to help him in return. After a clash with the military, the Hulk soon became a wanted monster, with Rick being the only person who knew who he really was. Over the following weeks, the Hulk changed in a number of ways, noticeably shifting from gray to green with his second transformation. Initially, Banner became the Hulk whenever night fell, and Rick helped him construct a number of hidden bases where the monster could be contained until morning. However, the commanding officer at Desert Base, Thunderbolt Ross, soon tricked Rick into aiding his attempt to banish the Hulk into space. Rick intervened when he realized what was happening and received an electric shock from the rocket control panel at the same moment that the Hulk was struck by cosmic rays. The Hulk crash-landed once again and no longer reverted back to Bruce Banner in the daylight. Furthermore, Rick found that the two had been psionically linked, allowing him to command the Hulk. However, if Rick fell asleep or lost consciousness, the Hulk would regain control of itself and disregard any standing orders. Soon the psychic connection was broken when Rick used one of Banner's gamma-ray machines to transform the Hulk back to human form. After that, Banner succeeded in gaining control over his Hulk form and began using the machine to intentionally transform back and forth. While Banner attempted to use the Hulk for good, Rick reconnected with some of the friends he'd made in his travels and, inspired by their enthusiasm for ham radio, organized a nationwide network of like-minded teenagers called the Teen Brigade. Naturally, some details of this have changed with the sliding timeline, with older stories showing the Teen Brigade communicating via radio, whereas modern retellings depict them sending encoded messages using the internet. In any event, when an alien invader known as the Metal Master invaded the Earth, Rick and the Teen Brigade tracked his movements, assisting the Hulk in his efforts to find and defeat him. But in the midst of all of this, the Hulk was slowly developing its own separate persona once again, and his transformations began to be triggered by stress and anger. Rick remained a friend and ally to both Banner and the Hulk, even as he grew more concerned about the unpredictability of his temper. Soon, the mischievous god Loki took notice of the Green Goliath and decided to use him against his brother Thor. To this end, he tricked the Hulk into nearly derailing a train by crashing into the tracks. Ultimately, nobody was hurt because the Hulk was able to hold the tracks together long enough for the train to pass overhead unharmed, but the Green Goliath was nonetheless vilified by the media, which blamed him for the apparent attack. Recognizing that the Hulk had been becoming more unpredictable, Rick Jones had the Teen Brigade send a message to the Fantastic Four, hoping that they could help the Hulk if he was innocent, and stop him if he was guilty. Loki intercepted this transmission and redirected it to his brother's human alter ego, Donald Blake. But what he didn't count on was other heroes detecting the message and tracking it to its source. Thus, Rick Jones and the Teen Brigade came face to face with Iron Man, Thor, Ant-Man, and the Wasp. Of course, in the end, Loki's machinations were uncovered and the assembled heroes joined forces with the Hulk to form a new team, the Mighty Avengers. Rick and the Teen Brigade continued to help the Avengers in their early days, even as the Hulk became convinced that the others didn't trust him and left the team. But soon the Avengers found another to join their ranks, the wartime hero Steve Rogers, aka Captain America. Now, you may be familiar with the story of how Captain America and his loyal partner, Bucky Barnes, clashed with the notorious Baron Zemo at the end of World War II. While they succeeded in thwarting Zemo's schemes, Bucky was seemingly killed in an explosion and Steve fell into the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, where his body was frozen in a state of suspended animation until he was found and recovered by the Avengers decades later. Shortly after being revived, a groggy Captain America briefly mistook Rick for Bucky, noting a resemblance between them. Meanwhile, Rick had lost contact with the other Avengers when an alien assailant used a machine that turned them to stone. While Rogers was still acclimating to the new world he found himself in, Rick convinced him to help rescue the others. Using his knowledge and connections, Rick located the culprit responsible so that Captain America could confront and unmask the alien, forcing him to restore the Avengers. Steve was officially inducted onto the team, and Rick became a trusted friend and confidant who helped him catch up on things that he missed. Rick even convinced Steve to train him in gymnastics and hand-to-hand combat, including karate and judo techniques. For a time, he was seen as Captain America's sidekick and was given an Avengers ID card that allowed him to alert the others. However, when Rick attempted to actually become Steve's new partner by donning a replica of Bucky's old costume, the idea was shot down. Similarly, when Iron Man suggested that Rick be made an Avenger in a more official capacity with his own uniform, the notion was again vetoed by Captain America. Rick soon found himself wishing that he had superpowers of his own, and as a result fell into a trap laid by the time-traveling manipulator Immortus. He was ultimately found and rescued by Captain America, although the whole ordeal would go unremembered after time was effectively reversed to before it happened. In any event, Rick began to rethink his position with the Avengers when the remaining founders took leaves of absence, and reformed criminals, Scarlet Witch, Quicksilver, and Hawkeye were recruited to replace them. Captain America intended on convincing the Hulk to rejoin as well and asked Rick if he could find them. However, Rick secretly felt dejected over not being able to join the team himself. He ultimately left, and while he did locate the Hulk, he decided to stay with and continue aiding Banner. When Banner was accused of being a foreign spy, Rick spoke on his behalf and even succeeded in using his Avengers ID to meet with the President of the United States. However, later there was an incident in which the Hulk was hit by an experimental weapon that sent him into a far future timeline. Thinking he was dead, Rick confessed to Major Glenn Talbot, an Air Force officer stationed at Desert Base, that Banner and the Hulk were one and the same. The Hulk returned not long thereafter, but the cat was officially out of the bag. Rick stuck around and continued to offer dissenting opinions when the likes of General Thunderbolt Ross sought to destroy the Hulk, but things began to change when the villainous Puppet Master used his radioactive clay to seize control of the gamma-powered monster. During this incident, a mind-controlled Hulk struck and injured Rick Jones. Rick ultimately recovered, but admitted during a television interview that he had finally realized just how dangerous the Hulk really was. That situation soon came to a head when one of the Hulk's rampages was interrupted by Captain America. Wanting to believe in his friend, Rick intervened in the battle and tried once again to talk to the Hulk. However, the enraged monster continued to fight and, not realizing his own strength, nearly killed Rick without meaning to as he caused a nearby building to collapse. Fortunately, Rick survived with only minor injuries when he was pulled away by Captain America. Cap brought Rick back to Avengers headquarters to recover, knowing that he couldn't let him return to the Hulk again. After awakening, Rick once again tried to convince Steve to let him adopt Bucky's old costumed identity. While hesitant, this time Steve agreed and the two faced off against the likes of Hydra and AIM together. However, their partnership came to an end after the Red Skull used the reality-altering cosmic cube to switch bodies with Captain America. Unaware of the switch, Rick tried to approach who he thought was his friend and ally, only to be slapped away and rejected. After that, Rick Jones ripped up his mask, abandoned his ID card, and left Avengers Mansion. He hit the road again, unaware that he was already getting caught up in another adventure. At the same time, off in space, the ruler of the intergalactic Kree Empire, the Supreme Intelligence, manipulated the heroic officer, Captain Mar-Vell, and trapped him in the antimatter universe known as the Negative Zone. The Supreme Intelligence also mentally influenced Rick from afar, causing him to hitchhike into the middle of the desert, where a vision of Captain America guided him to an abandoned Kree outpost. There he discovered a set of weapons called the nega bands and placed them on his wrists. He soon discovered that by striking the bands together, Rick Jones and Mar-Vell could swap places, with one existing in positive space while the other remained trapped in the negative zone. The two also found that they had been telepathically bound and entered into a partnership in which Rick could continue to live his life on Earth, but would call forth Captain Mar-Vell whenever the hero was needed. Of course, this sometimes led to interruptions while Rick tried to build a career as a professional musician. He began searching for a solution and soon reunited with Bruce Banner, who was still on the run as a fugitive. Suffice it to say, things went sideways and ended with a fight between Captain Mar-Vell and the Hulk. However, they did learn that Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four had access to the Negative Zone and subsequently used his portal in the Baxter Building to return Rick to Earth. But not long after that, Rick Jones, Mar-Vell, and the Avengers were caught up in the events of the Kree-Skrull War. In the midst of that conflict, Rick was abducted by the Kree and brought before the Supreme Intelligence. Again manipulating things for his own purposes, the Supreme Intelligence guided Rick, helping him realize humanity's latent potential to access an enigmatic energy called the Destiny Force. Using this power, Rick conjured duplicates of heroes he'd read about as a child and used them to defend himself against the Kree forces of Ronan the Accuser. He then used the Destiny Force to target every Kree and Skrull across multiple galaxies, temporarily freezing them in place and forcing them into an uneasy peace. However, channeling this level of power nearly killed Rick, and Mar-Vell was forced to molecularly bond their life forces together to save him. The alien hero seemingly disappeared, and a revived Rick Jones was sent back to Earth with the Avengers. Initially thinking Mar-Vell was dead, Rick returned to his music career with the help of a promoter who previously took notice of his talent, Mordecai P. Boggs. He also met a singer named Luann, and the two grew close quickly. In the midst of this, however, Rick learned that not only was Mar-Vell still alive within him, but that their combined life energies were too much for Rick's human body. When Rick collapsed from the strain, Luann brought him to her uncle, Professor Benjamin Savannah. In an attempt to repair his weakened molecular structure, Savannah bathed Rick in positively charged photons, inadvertently rearranging his atomic structure, effectively swapping him for Captain Mar-Vell. As a result, Rick was suddenly in the same situation as before, in which he could summon Captain Mar-Vell by striking the negabands together, sending himself to the negative zone in the process. He was initially reluctant to continue these adventures, but at some point he did regain his old Avengers ID card. Mar-Vell and the Avengers subsequently had their first major conflict with Thanos, and Rick Jones even briefly came face to face with the Mad Titan himself. Such events wore heavily on Rick's mind, but Mar-Vell attempted to be there for him as a friend through their telepathic connection. He encouraged Rick to continue his music, and Mordecai booked him as an opening act alongside a woman named Rachel Dandridge, or Dandy, in a 14-city tour. That night, Rick also broke off his burgeoning relationship with Luann, as he was never able to stay in one place long enough to settle down. Following another adventure in the negative zone, Rick and Mar-Vell learned how to fuse together and separate at will, and thus both were able to return to the positive universe. However, when Rick went to play in the show that Mordecai had booked for him, he was dismayed to find that he'd been billed as a comedic novelty act rather than a serious musician. Brokenhearted, he decided to join Mar-Vell in his further adventures into space. The two came face to face once again with the Supreme Intelligence, who confessed that he'd been manipulating both of them and ultimately wanted to absorb Rick's mind into its own collective consciousness. For those unaware, the Supreme Intelligence was an artificial organism containing the minds of countless Kree warriors, scientists, and philosophers. While it failed in its goal of assimilating Rick and gaining access to the Destiny Force, it did split the power of the negative bands between him and Mar-Vell. With each man wearing one of the bands, Rick attained similar powers but opted against using the moniker Marvel Boy. Not long after that, Rick met a human-looking woman named Fawn, not realizing that he had subconsciously created her using the negaband. Initially invisible to others, her behavior, while flirtatious, was often strange, like when she convinced Rick to remove his space helmet on a planet with an atmosphere that was poisonous to humans. In the end, she helped Rick in a battle against the Supremer, a physical manifestation of the Supreme Intelligence, but was struck down and destroyed as Rick lacked the energy to revive her. Rick and Mar-Vell ultimately defeated the Supreme Intelligence once again and merged so that they could make the journey back to Earth. But during the trip, Mar-Vell was nearly caught in a black hole, the gravity of which affected the negabands and caused Rick to once again be shunted into the negative zone. They attempted to use the Fantastic Four's portal to retrieve him, but found that Rick was unable to leave without Mar-Vell using the negabands to replace him. Fortunately, they soon found a way around this when Mar-Vell tricked a power-copying android called the Super Adaptoid into mimicking the negabands and forcing him to trade places with Rick. No longer needing Mar-Vell's life force to survive, this act finally permanently severed their link. In the midst of all of this, Rick also returned to his music career once again, and as he found his own voice and style, success began to follow. He nonetheless remained friends with Mar-Vell and was dismayed to later learn that the hero had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Rick initially responded with anger when it seemed as though Mar-Vell had given up and resigned himself to death, but ultimately came to apologize when Mar-Vell was on his deathbed and stayed by his side until he passed. That event marks the end of Captain Mar-Vell's story, but we've really only scratched the surface of Rick Jones and the various forms and identities he would take over the years. So if you want a follow-up video to this one, be sure to let me know in the comments. In the meantime, that's all I've got for you this week, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them before yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there is anything in particular that you want me to talk about, then be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!